to one of the best lectures within the series. This one is always popular among the students. Welcome to our coverage of Russia, a country that I'm certain every single one knows something about, right? At the end of the day, you know that at least its president has been in power in some way, shape, or form for the last 20 years. Welcome to really a thorough discussion on not just the current political climate within Russia, but a discussion, I'm hoping to have a very frank and open discussion about the so-called sovereign democracy of Vladimir Putin. So this lecture, which draws from material that I have offered in both my comparative politics class and the parallel course on Russian foreign policy that some of you that are involved in this class also took with me about a year or two ago. But this lecture in specific, looks at the philosophy of sovereign democracy and argues that it is really presenting itself as the antithesis to liberal democracy that seems to be struggling throughout continental Europe. The sovereign democracy of Putin is really the ideological foundation on which we get the type of illiberal political leadership of Viktor Orban and Yaroslav Kaczynski and Alexander Vucic, among others. But the other thing that I want to focus on in this lecture, and I hope that in addition to understanding what sovereign democracy is, you will also understand why Vladimir Putin remains so charismatically popular in Russia today. And I know that for an American audience, Putin in particular and largely Russia in general is seen as the big threat to American global order, American democratic decency. Russophobia kind of runs rampant through American political culture. And of course, Putin is seen as the constant scapegoat for, all of this country's problems. Putin has stymied America's efforts at embedding democracy in the Middle East, to the idea that Putin single-handedly entered into all of your minds in 2016 and forced many Americans to vote for Donald Trump. Allegedly, this is what the MSNBC narrative wants you to believe. But what I want to do in this lecture is really cover the specifics of Russia and Russian political culture to get a sense really of why Russia is so important to understanding post-communist political development, not just in the former Soviet Union, but also in many cases in Eastern Europe, the Middle East, and elsewhere. And so it really is this philosophy of sovereign democracy that I hope to end this lecture on that will shed some light on why Putin remains as popular and as influential as he does. And, one very important thing to note before we get into the specifics here is to note that we are not just talking about Russia as a standalone country, but Russia and the so-called near abroad. Now, the term near abroad normally is offered in quotes because it's more of a subjective term than anything definitive. But the near abroad can incorporate everything from the former Soviet republics outside of Russia. So, Ukraine, Belarus, Kazakhstan, and others. Usually the Baltics aren't included in this, but, some still do when we talk about the presence of Russian communities, Russian-speaking, Russian cultural communities living outside of Russia. And according to Putin, about 25 million Russians live outside of Russia proper. And so it's Russia's obligation, its duty, its purpose, to not just assert itself as a strong global power today, but also to speak on behalf of these Russian-speaking communities. This is less problematic in Central Asia, specifically Kazakhstan, as it is more currently in Ukraine, specifically when we talk about the Crimean Peninsula, and, to a lesser extent, Belarus, Latvia, Lithuania, and Estonia. But Russia sees itself today, the Russian government, the philosophy of Putin, sees themselves as not only the caretakers of the Russian state, but the spokespeople for the Russian nation, no matter where they happen to be. But first and foremost, outside of Russia, within this so-called near abroad. So Russia really is that major external actor that for the former Soviet Union serves as this influencing element that the European Union had done and continues to do for Central and Southeastern Europe. And look, let's make no mistake about it here. Russia is a major world power. It is reemerging, I would say, from the years of turmoil from the 1990s as a major economic power within the Eurasian region. I think at this point, that argument has already been solved. Putin has put Russia back on the map, for better or for worse. It is a major influencing power in the Middle East, specifically its relationship with Syria, Iran, and also Turkey, we can't forget. Russia has never really gone away as an international influencer in Central Asia, and ever since the breakup of the Soviet Union, Russia has maintained relatively good working relationships with the 5 Stan countries, Kazakhstan being one of the main ones of that. Russia is a major power broker within the Caucasus. These are the countries of Georgia, Azerbaijan, and Armenia. And of the 3, Russia has been really a primary ally of Armenia in a long, protracted territorial war with neighboring Azerbaijan. Azerbaijan retook much of the so-called Republic of Artsakh, this sort of breakaway territory controlled by Armenia last year. And Russia kind of has inserted itself as the power broker, the resolver of conflict between the 2 countries. One thing that we can take away from this is that when Russia decides to take the lead in conflict resolution, it's going to be dictated on Putin's terms, and Russia will somehow come out as the winner. We also note this with the protracted conflict in Ukraine, not just in the Crimean Peninsula, but also in the eastern region of the Donbass. And, outside the former Soviet Union, Russia continues to be a major influence within the Balkans, specifically Serbia. We talked about that last week. So Russian foreign policy, and again, for the 2 of you, I think, that had me for Russian foreign policy last year, this should be, still fresh in your mind. Russia is a major international player, right, alongside that of the United States and China. But Russia, reasserting itself after, the years of turmoil following the collapse of the Soviet Union, had a brief but notable moment of being a weak democracy in the 1990s to really a transitioning illiberal democracy to what we can really consider more so today to be a more authoritarian-like hybrid regime, right? Russia is rated not free in Freedom House. Again, you can take that data however way that you want, but it is, clear as day that the political rights and civil liberties that were nascent and fledgling under Boris Yeltsin in the 1990s have come far more under this top-down, heavy, executive, paternalistic control of Putin. So the shock therapy that Russia had to go through in the 1990s, and if you remember from my previous lecture, shock therapy is very good at creating the conditions for hybrid regimes. The philosophy of political leadership in Russia is this type of sovereign democracy of Vladimir Putin. We'll get into the specifics towards the end of this discussion. And, Russia today in 2020, 2021 serves as a political, diplomatic, and ideological counterbalance to and frequent scapegoat of weakening Western democracies. So even within, American media, there is this constant fear that Russia is asserting itself, interfering in American socio-political affairs. How dare a country other than the United States do this? But this is kind of the nature of where we are today. And, Russia, Putin seemed to, have sort of a popularity following among many people who are critical of liberal democracy. It doesn't necessarily mean that they are pro-Putin, but the ideology of Putin is very good at pointing out the weaknesses and the shortcomings of liberal democracy, especially neoliberal democracy. But Russia is probably the best example of a post-Soviet state, an example of a state that has transitioned away from single-party bureaucratic authoritarian rule, but has gone through all of the turmoil that one could expect from this sudden collapse of a major superpower, both on the political and economic levels, but also within the institutional and cultural. Russia has reasserted itself as Russian as opposed to Soviet, which is much more multi-ethnic and certainly takes on sort of an international Marxist flavor and identity. But when we look at Russia, even during the good years of the 90s under Yeltsin, and here when I say good, I'm really talking about from the point of view of an academic democratic, right? So, Russia in the 90s was just absolutely horrible in terms of corruption, formlessness, and looming chaos. But when we think about it from, let's say, democratic perspectives, Russia kind of experienced a brief, albeit very brief, period of some degrees of political rights and civil liberties. But the transition, even there, took place in the absence of any real political opposition, right? Even, the positive assessments that many people in the West have of Boris Yeltsin overlooks the idea that there really was no alternative. There was no opposition. I mean, there were political parties and movements within Russia, but they tended to either be the unreformed communists that were looking for some comeback, or the ultra-nationalists that were looking to take the country in even more chaotic directions. So, Yeltsin may actually be seen as kind of an early proto-stabilicrat that presented himself to the West, specifically the White House, as this is all that Russia is right now. So you need to give all your support, all your money, all your leverage to me. Otherwise, the country might descend into chaos. Oh, and one other thing. This country has nukes. Right? So, you've seen enough James Bond movies to know that this is just not what you want. So Russia's making this transition not only in the wake of the abrupt collapse of the Soviet Union, but among the age of globalization where shock therapy is basically saying free market fundamentalism is going to solve everything. So it's within this understanding that we get this more paternalistic, authoritarian rule of Putin following 2000, in which there is this new kind of branded Russia that seeks to not just promote specifically Russian history and heritage, but bringing back nostalgic images, symbols, and memories of the Soviet Union, which, yes, there are elements of authoritarian nostalgia, but also this understanding that many Russians felt genuinely aggrieved that the Soviet Union, as the Soviet Union, collapsed. So that's why today, right, Russian identity, national identity will, look at this hybrid between the red star, the hammer and sickle, and the double-headed eagle of the Romanov dynasty. What we find largely absent within this discussion, especially within Russia's, hodgepodge of cultural capital, is the absence of any real Russian liberal nationalism. Right? People are constantly looking for that Lech Walesa or Václav Havel in Russia to somehow steer the country away from the authoritarianism of Putin. And I think that that's why, neoliberal newspapers like the Washington Post and the New York Times or, journals like The Economist or whatever, they put a lot of, in my opinion, over-exaggerated hope in people like Alexei Navalny or Garry Kasparov, right? They're outspoken critics of Putin. They must have some kind of, underground political following that needs to be funded and supported from the outside. And I'm here to tell you, unfortunately, that these guys tend to have more followers outside of Russia than they do inside. So I'm not here to say that Russia is a lost cause, and I'm also not here to tell you that Putin is all evil, gloom, and doom that, most neoliberals want you to think. Russia is Russia. And there ain't no one that's going to steer Russia away from what it has decided to be. So the best thing that we can do is just make sense of what has happened in the last 30 years as a way of giving us better predictive power for what the next 5 to 10 will give us. And that's why whenever I teach about the current political situation of Russia, I always feel obligated to start with the Yeltsin era. This is what I lovingly, euphemistically call Russia's Weimar period. And I think that the term is quite appropriate because Russia in the 90s was this dynamic but oftentimes chaotic experience of democratic pluralism amid rampant corruption, political fragmentation, and economic breakdown. I mean, we are really looking at Russia in the wake of not just the collapse of the Soviet Union, but the collapse of the Soviet Union's global hegemonic influence. And Russia is kind of broken, beaten, right? It lost the Cold War in terms of the battles of ideologies. And so the articles like, Jeffrey Sachs's What Is to Be Done is reminiscent of the general attitude among the West that we've won the battle. We've won the ideological battle. The best thing for Russia to do now is to fully embrace the ideology that it previously worked so hard to avoid, and that is capitalism. We're not even interested if Russia goes democratic. We just want to see more McDonald's, more Western consumer goods. We want to see Russia basically turn itself into one large shopping mall for American products. And because the emphasis on economics was so important, the political aspects, the cultural aspects of a country in the wake of imperial and hegemonic decline was overlooked. Right? The idea is, just let them drink more Coca-Colas and eat more Big Macs, they'll get over it. Not really. The country nears economic collapse, almost bankruptcy, by 1996. And we also realize that by the mid-90s, Yeltsin is not this lovable, huggable, half-in-the-bag, Russian bear that we like to think of him as in the early 90s. I mean, Yeltsin, had his moment when the Soviet Union collapsed. And yes, he was instrumental in carrying the country into, breakup. But he proved to be increasingly inept, heavily unpopular at home because all of the political and economic turmoil was blamed on him, and just increasingly dependent, almost, absolutely begging the West to help him and his party out. This produces, kind of this backlash among many non-democratic elements in Russian political society, chief of which was the resilience of the Communist Party, which, today the Communist Party of Russia is really more or less just a pensioners' party. But in the mid-90s, there was a serious threat of them retaking control. And we're not talking about the reformed communists of Poland or Hungary or anything else like that, right? We're talking about angry communists that wanted to bring back some Soviet type of rule. And Yeltsin had been fighting with them pretty much since the country's breakup. In fact, there was this, highly televised confrontation between the Russian military and the Communist Party officials that had kind of barricaded themselves within the Parliament House, refusing to, break any political deadlock, preventing Yeltsin from enacting reforms and policies, in which Yeltsin just ordered the military to literally strike the Parliament building. I mean, we're talking about if there was no military strike that overthrew the Soviet Union, we had that moment in 1993 when the communists were practically smoked out of the Parliament House. But in addition to the internal political turmoil, we also find that Russia's foreign policy was just decaying one by one. So it's one thing that the Soviet Union breaks up, but then it's another thing when we find additional separatist movements within Russia itself, chief of which was in Chechnya. And what's even more problematic about Chechnya is that, a band of, small, militants that, yes, they got funding from Al-Qaeda and other Islamic terrorist groups, were able to rout the Red Army and basically kick them out of Chechnya. The place became sort of a quasi-independent no man's land for much of the 1990s, was probably the most symbolic elements of the once mighty Red Army being demoralized, antiquated, and completely inept at even keeping order within their own country. I think the final nail in the coffin of Yeltsin's failed attempt at democracy was actually in Serbia, when NATO, led by both the UK and the United States, had ordered military airstrikes over what was then Yugoslavia because of the ongoing conflict within Kosovo, Russia was completely ignored. Like just overwhelmed, it just ignored at the UN, first in their opposition to the conflict, and then in their opposition to what was basically Kosovo's administrative separation from the rest of Serbia. And to which the United States responded was, who cares about what Russia thinks? Russia is weak, Russia's irrelevant, and they'll eventually come around to supporting us, right? So, the nadir of Russia's pre-Putin foreign policy comes right at the apex of, in my opinion, America's unipolar influence around the world, right? Shortly after 1999, right, we get 9/11, and and America's unipolar power begins to decline. So this is kind of seen as just the final humiliating nail in the coffin that started the country out in the early 90s with optimism, and I think with genuine hope that things were going to get better. But by the end of the 90s, Yeltsin was seen as just completely incompetent. And again, I have to mention this, right? He was increasingly drunk as well. The man was not healthy. He kind of was losing touch with reality and was seen more as a joke in the international arena than anything else. Until Putin comes in. And this is where we find the major turning point within Russia's post-Soviet development. In order to understand the importance and the symbolic prominence of Vladimir Putin, you gotta get the backstory to Russia in the 90s. And I like to say that Vladimir Putin was to Russia what Grand Admiral Thrawn was to the Galactic Empire after the Battle of Endor. Now, there's a few of you that are going to be like, I know exactly what you're talking about, and good for you for being good Star Wars nerds. There's a bunch of you that are going to be like, I have no idea what you're talking about here. So I'll just briefly mention for those that are, not big Star Wars fans, right? The end of Return of the Jedi, the big battle of Endor, the Death Star blows up, the Emperor, Darth Vader, Admiral Piet, they all die, right? The Executor's destroyed. And as far as Star Wars lore is concerned, especially the old legend stuff now, right? The Empire fragments into a series of warlords. Some of them are competent, others are power-hungry, until Grand Admiral Thrawn, like the last big Grand Admiral of the old empire, decides to arrive to clean up whatever is left of the empire, reorganize it, rearm it, and give it some kind of purpose. In this sense, Putin follows very much in the footsteps of this, fictitious character. We all, those of you who know about him, right, he rose through the ranks of the KGB, was about to kind of enter into his own when everything collapses in 89, 90, 91. But, Putin is less of a politician and more of somebody who was well skilled in security and diplomacy. So for him to provide this new Spartan, Machiavellian type of character from that of Yeltsin is lost really on no one, right? Yeltsin was buffoonish. He might have been a lovable, huggable, uncle or grandpa, but Putin could kick your ass, right? Putin is somebody who, as I said, is more of a military individual than a politician. And look, we all know the photos. Some of them have been over-exaggerated, but in many respects, Putin himself has no problem with them because it presents an image of a strong, assertive, and, highly intelligent leader who can, hunt in the morning and still, appreciate little chicks in the afternoon. Right? Go back to his horse hunting and, or traveling or whatever it is, right? This type of macho alpha-like mentality, but still have time for little kids, right? Here's Putin having some tea time with this, happy little girl here. Also, hey, he's a great fan of dogs. You can't say no to them. I mean, how could you not trust this guy here? Look at how happy Putin looks, right? So again, Putin's brand image as kind of this most interesting man in the world, this man of all shapes and sizes, this Renaissance man, this person who just comes out of nowhere to save Russia from itself, right? Reorganize, get rid of corruption, or at the absolute least, rein in corruption under his control. Yeah, makes him a total badass. And this is something that I think is unappreciated in American society where, well, I don't know. I mean, let me explain. I honestly think that American society's proclivity for this type of leadership may explain why so many people just, blindly follow the persona and the charisma of someone like Donald Trump, right? The same type of thing, although nowhere near as organized or as competent. But, in any event here, the thing to understand is that whether Putin is behind this identity or whether this is something that has been collectively adopted, is that Putin remains Russia's savior. And in order to understand that narrative, you have to understand that what is Russia being saved from? The chaos of the 1990s, the chaos of Yeltsin, the ambiguity, the uncertainty, and the anarchy of Western-based neoliberalism. And this is a recurring juxtaposition that has been used within Russian political culture since the mid-2000s. And the juxtaposition of the chaos of Yeltsin and the managed democracy, the managed leadership of Putin, someone who openly and unapologetically proclaimed that the collapse of the Soviet Union was the biggest tragedy to befall Russia of the 20th century. And to say to a constituency that was eager to hear this, it's okay to be nostalgic for the Soviet Union. It's perfectly fine to be proud of what the Soviet Union was. And as far as Russians are concerned, the Soviet Union was more than Stalin and gulags and, collective farms that is, largely understood here in the United States, right? We'll take the worst elements of the 1930s famine and say that's what the Soviet Union was. For most people from that region, the Soviet Union was first man in space, first satellite in space, excelling students and scientists and intellectuals in art, science, mathematics, literature, music, poetry, right? The Soviet Union was something that shouldn't just be thrown out just because a bunch of aging bureaucrats didn't know how to handle it. And so in that sense, this sense of neo-Soviet patriotism after a decade of post-Soviet incongruency was met with resounding approval by many people, especially those who had fond memories of the Soviet Union. I mean, chief of which was that Putin brings back the Victory Day parades, which commemorated the Soviet Union's victory over Nazi Germany in 1945. But beyond just simply the symbolic, right, Putin has, in many ways successfully, reasserted the authority of Russia at the federal level over a number of regional units that just kind of fell off by the wayside, just semi-declared autonomy. And you got to remember, Russia's a huge country, even by itself. I think it's like 9 time zones or something like that. It takes like a week to go from one end of the country to the other by train. And, these far-off flung places, very easy, very tempting to just kind of seize power with regional governors or mayors or whatever and just kind of do their own thing. Russia under Putin has reasserted federal authority and re-centralized the country, still under a federation, but make no mistake about it, right? Everything starts and ends in Moscow. And, by the mid-2000s, we're already beginning to see the decline of American international standing after, the disastrous war on terror, especially the invasion of Iraq. Russia has methodically, under Putin, reasserted its place in the international arena. Not as an open counterbalance to the United States, but one that wants to work with the U.S. in achieving transnational global security. But if the United States looks at Russia and just perceives it to be a threat, a challenge, or whatever, then, many leaders, George W. Bush certainly in particular, Barack Obama, I got to say, was also problematic with this, will mistrust Russia and decide to act more unilaterally, which creates more problems in places like Syria, Iraq, Libya, and elsewhere. So, the difference between Russia in the 90s and Russia by, let's say, 2009, 2010, right, was absolutely stark. But make no mistake about it, though, folks. Russia's GDP has grown, exponentially in that. I mean, just take a look at I know that these figures are a bit outdated here, but take a look at Russia from 2006 to 2014. Right? You can't argue with numbers. And just as Yeltsin may have been unjustly blamed for Russia's economic collapse in the 90s, you can say this is more shock therapy than anything else, Putin is given the credit for bringing Russia back, right? For reasserting Russia's place within the world. Of course, at the same time, Russia is overwhelmingly corrupt, right? So I think these are 2019 figures here. But, Russia ranked 136 on the corruption scale, right? So just, tied with Nigeria, and for God's sake, Russia's even more corrupt than Pakistan. And you kind of take a look at the goody two-shoes Scandinavian countries and New Zealand up there, and, Russia hasn't necessarily cleaned up its corruption so much as it has reorganized and controlled it. And, a third thing to note, and this certainly adds to Russia's understanding of being an emerging economic power, but also heavily corrupt, is its diplomacy through pipelines, right? Oil, natural gas pipelines. This gives one a sense of how Russia has been able to embed itself within Central and even Western Europe through natural resource provision more than the Red Army ever could have done. So these are the big ones, right? These are not all the pipelines. These are just the real big ones here. These major pipelines that are coming from, northern Russia, Siberia, supplying natural gas and oil, primarily to these countries here, Germany, Austria, Italy, France. They all have to travel through Central Europe. They all have to travel through, the near abroad, which makes these countries economically dependent on Russia's supply. Why? Because the Germans, the Italians, the Austrians, and the French, they don't want any problem here, interrupting the supply line. Not a surprise, additional pipelines bypass the Baltics going directly into Germany, even through the Balkans, right? It all goes here to keep these countries economically cooperative, which means that if there's any problems here, especially between Ukraine and Belarus, the Germans, the Italians, the French, they're going to side with Russia over any nascent movements, political or otherwise here, because, the spice must flow. What's also important about this is that pipeline diplomacy, especially when it comes to the Balkans, has kept many of these countries within Russia's sphere of influence. Now, South Stream was a pipeline that was canceled. The European Union put pressure on Bulgaria to cancel the construction of a major planned pipeline. But that didn't stop Russia. Russia decided to, instead of building a pipeline over Turkey, would do so through Turkey and have the pipeline end right here, conveniently at the Turkish, Greek, and Bulgarian border, effectively enticing these two countries, but especially Greece, to continue with that pipeline work. Now, this took place a number of years ago. Greece is reeling from economic uncertainties following the 2008 economic collapse. So the Greek government is almost pressured. It's just like they can't ignore this, right? They want the pipeline to continue, especially when countries like Serbia and Bosnia and others were eager for South Stream to be built. So if the pipeline does go through Greece, there are plans to continue it through Serbia, Hungary, and then into Austria and elsewhere. So this also shows that Russia has been able to use its leverage to greater degrees than it ever had under the Soviet Union. Now, that's Russia's international image, right? When we look at the internal politics, I don't want to spend too much time on this here, right? Russia is a presidential system. It's actually sort of semi-presidential, semi-parliamentary, but be that as it may, the presidency in Russia, at least as far as the Constitution is concerned, is more akin to, let's say, the American or the French president, right? So there is a prime minister. The prime minister just tends to be more or less the Speaker of the House and Parliament. The presidency is separate from the legislature, so we have a separation of powers as opposed to a fusion in a parliamentary system. But realistically speaking, the Russian president has far more degrees of power over other branches of the Russian government. So, you think of, American government and you think legislative, executive, judicial, and it's, 33%. Within Russia, the presidency is more like, I would say, 70%, with 15% each going to legislative and judicial. The presidency also has the power to appoint prime ministers and regional governments. So we're not talking about people who just simply represent a political party that gets a majority in the Duma, but they are handpicked by the president. Not a surprise, Russia's current prime minister, Dmitry Medvedev, was president about 10 plus years ago during a time when Putin had to step down after 2 consecutive terms. Medvedev was appointed, endorsed by Putin to become president, just won hands down in a landslide election. And what does Medvedev do? Appoints Putin as prime minister. And we're all thinking at the time, is this a transitional period, or is Medvedev just holding the parking spot in time for Putin to run for a 3rd term? Because there's nothing saying that you couldn't run for a 3rd term that's non-consecutive with the previous 2. And that's exactly what happens. So under Putin, right, the presidency, and this is really Putin himself, has acquired almost total control over Russia's media, its security sector, and its mid-level executive bodies, right? So for, proponents of democracy, institutional democracy, this is by and large a dictatorship. And look, it's not that far off from observation. There is no significant political undertaking in Russia today that could be possible without the consent and in many cases the support of the presidential administration, chief of which is Vladimir Putin. And, when we talk about the presidential administration, right, the cabinet, this is a non-elected body. These are all handpicked by Putin, very similar to what we find the U.S. cabinet to be. But these individuals have disproportionate shares of power within Russia. So we're talking about, defense minister, foreign minister, economic and finance minister. These are people who, are not just, playing rotating chairs with every president. Putin has been in power now for decades. And, Russia's foreign minister, Sergei Lavrov, Russia's defense minister, I forget what his first name is, General Shoigu, whatever, right? I mean, these are career power brokers at this point. And they have inordinate degrees of pressure over the legislative and the judicial branches. Now, here's where things get a bit interesting. In spite of all of this, Putin has enjoyed, on average, popular support from roughly 70 to 80% of the population. Bad years for him is when its popularity slips to somewhere in the mid to low 60s. I mean, these are approval ratings that American presidents would kill for. And we could chalk that up to either Russians, again, I'm trying to think like somebody in the West here, either A, not knowing any better, or B, not fully appreciating democracy. But I think a more realistic thing is that, outside of the major urban centers of Moscow and St. Petersburg, where there might be some grumblings, the vast majority of Russians, especially people 45 and older, just see Putin at this point as a permanent mainstay. I mean, the man has been effectively running Russia for the last 20 years. That's a full generation for some people. Now, this popularity might drop as younger Russians who don't remember the 90s or the Soviet Union begin to come of age. And as far as they see with Putin, right, there is no difference between, him and the horrible Weimar era of the 1990s. They just see him as this constant power broker. But that remains to be seen. And be that as it may, Putin's position in power is a lot firmer than many of us in the West would want to think. And, it's a mixture of leadership, getting the message out about Russia now versus Russia back then. But I think it's also a sense of bringing, as I've mentioned beforehand, Russian collective memory into state-sponsored historical. So Russian history is Soviet history. World War II was a Soviet victory. That is still a Russian victory. But more so than just the Soviet Union, right? Russia today has successfully created this ongoing narrative, this national history that goes all the way back to, let's say, the medieval period, right? All the way back to, let's say, Vladimir the Great, Vladimir the First, which includes the Tsarist period, heavy influences and contributions from the Russian Orthodox Church, which, technically Russia is a secular state, but it appoints the Russian Orthodox Church as the primary socio-cultural institution of Russia's soul, right? It's its national character over the past 1,000 years. This is represented also within Russia's burgeoning art and literature field, right? 19th century, early 20th century, right? So Vladimir Putin, whom some people would be more than happy to crown czar, is just one more contributing leader to a larger and allegedly glorious history of Russian nation and statehood. And this is, again, a major juxtaposition to the period of chaos and uncertainty, nihilism, and low esteem from the 1990s. So this leads us to examine, therefore, the political philosophy of Vladimir Putin. Now, he did not coin the term sovereign democracy, but it has been used to define his political and ideological mantra. And in order to explain what sovereign democracy is, it's not an easy definition. So it's more like a story to tell. And the understanding of sovereign democracy is that it's a type of custom designed model of democracy that is fit for Russia. So this one-size-fits-all approach to neoliberalism, right, that all you got to do is just transform the market and everything will fall into place, has been resoundingly rejected by Putin and his followers. And they just simply say Exhibit A, the 1990s. But what they also do is suggest that sovereign democracy is and should be unique for every country. So the type of sovereign democracy practiced in Russia plays to Russian values, strengths, and idiosyncrasies. So the sovereign democracy in Hungary or Poland or Romania or Syria or Serbia or whatever needs to play on those cultural values as well. Also, the understanding here is not just simply play to your traditions, but build democracy through a type of founding fathers oligarchy. Right? So Putin has said, right, Russia was not ready for democracy when the Soviet Union fell. The Soviet Union collapsed and most people didn't even realize what was happening, hence the chaos and the decay that Russian state and society fell into throughout much of the 90s with, alcoholism, drugs, militant separatist groups, organized criminal syndicates, high levels of corruption, an explosion of billionaires, while the vast majority of the population just became comparatively poorer and less politically involved. So the understanding of sovereign democracy is that in order to build democracy, the state must restore its sovereignty first, and then build democracy second. So in other words, the country was not only racked by the collapse of the Soviet Union, but then just kicked around and abused by globalization. So in order to provide stability, order, and some positive future, a number of socio-political actors must effectively take control of the country in some type of caretaker, paternalistic type of leadership and reconstruct the country from the ground up, right? Build solid foundations of a middle class, a competent bureaucracy, an effective military, and a strong economy that relies less on exports than what it, that relies on imports, than what it produces itself. And not surprisingly, Putin argues, the United Russia Party that he's part of, actually, the United Russia Party kind of grew around him, right? Not the other way around. But the United Russia Party should rule the country for 15 to 20 years, right? In state-led development. Very similar to, let's say, what the LDP, the Liberal Democratic Party of Japan, did from, let's say, the 40s to, really, the late 80s. Or the INC, the Indian National Congress, did from 47 to the 1970s. So in other words, the country just needs to be under steady leadership without the constant need for fluctuating between opposition movements, without the need for demanding political rights and civil liberties before we talk about order, stability, and some kind of direction. So, you kind of liken it to building a house. You want to build a house that's going to last. You got to work on the foundations. You got to work on the cement. You got to work on the walls, the support, whatever. We're not going to talk about whether we want blinds or curtains for the windows until after the damn thing is built. We're not going to argue whether the walls should have wallpaper or stucco. We're not going to worry about interior decorating until the structure of the house is sound. Once you do that, well, then you can go to IKEA and do whatever the hell you want. So in other words, sovereign democracy is before we get into identity politics and liberal diversity and gay rights this and trans rights that and this, that, the other thing, right? And these are just simple examples that I'm using here. The country needs to know where it's going. They need to have some kind of direction. So we need to build democracy as structure, and that will create the necessary environment for democracy as practice, right? And so in this sense, we were to get more specific about Russia. This type of sovereign democracy was aimed at putting out all the fires that erupted during the 90s. So all the political and economic oligarchs that decided to just become these little petty warlords throughout the country were either going to be reined in by Putin or eliminated altogether. When I say eliminated, I don't mean bang bang. I just mean, thrown out of power, right? So loyalty and compliance to Moscow is going to be the big thing. As far as internal contagion of separatism is concerned, the Chechen terrorist movement was crushed. And this led to an enormous outpouring of support for Putin in 2005. So whatever errors, whatever problems that happened under Yeltsin, Putin put that fire out. Now, it really was a combination of a reorganized and revitalized military, but also working with the local warlords to basically buy their loyalty and support. I mean, this is one of the things. It's not that Chechnya is now this wonderful, diverse, inclusive place. Russia just found probably the biggest, baddest warlord out there and just said, how much would it cost for me to have you on my payroll? And the rest is, basically history. In addition to that, Russia reasserted itself in places like Georgia by taking control of two separatist breakaway areas, Abkhazia and South Ossetia, recognized their independence, but basically created parastates out of separatist movements, but really a way of countering the idea that the United States could be the only one doing this, as they did with Kosovo. Not a surprise. Russia's movements in Georgia in 2008 took place a few months after the United States told Kosovo that they could unilaterally declare independence, which goes against the UN, which goes against any UN resolution, but the United States said, we're going to go ahead and do it. And Russia's like, okay, well, if you can do it, I can do it as well. So Russia's regional strength has been reasserted, not just within the former Soviet Union, but Russia has successfully prevented Kosovo from being seen as an internationally sovereign state. Their veto, as well as the Chinese veto, keeps Kosovo out of the UN. And Kosovo just kind of remains this indefinite frozen conflict, but it's a great way of maintaining political alliances and leverage with Serbia. Russia's incursion into Crimea, it sort of came as a surprise to everyone, but this was seen as a major slight against Russia's national history, in which the Crimean Peninsula historically has been, demographically populated by Russians. They all saw themselves as part of Russia. But as long as all of this was in the Soviet Union, it didn't matter whether Crimea was part of Russia or Ukraine. But when the Soviet Union breaks up, Crimea goes with Ukraine to be an independent state. And, the accommodation throughout much of the 90s and 2000s were that the Russian-speaking population would have special autonomous status, and Russia would lease its naval base in Crimea, at least, once a year, once every 10 years, whatever it happens to be. The colored revolution that takes place in Ukraine in 2014 creates this turmoil in which Russia sees itself as losing its control over what, Ukraine is like, an integral part of Russia's near abroad. So in seizing, literally seizing and annexing Crimea into Russia, and realizing that no one's really going to stop them from doing this, this certainly played to local nationalist flavor and added to the understanding that Putin is reasserting Russia's control, influence within the region. This is mirrored the following year with support given to rebels, separatists within the eastern region of Donbass. We'll get to both of these in more specifics in the following lecture. Alongside that, Russia basically bailed Bashar al-Assad out of being thrown out of power. And in the accompanying Charlie Rose interview that I am going to post on this channel, you get to see Putin's philosophy for sovereign democracy played out really well here. Russia intervenes in the Syrian civil war, basically stopping Assad from losing power and the country descending into chaos. Putin will always say that he is not so much pro-Assad as he is supporting the legitimate government of an internationally recognized country. More to the point, previous efforts at overthrowing legitimate governments, no matter how bad they might have been, creates more problems. Exhibit A, Iraq. Exhibit B, Libya. Exhibit C, the current crisis Ukraine finds itself in. So to envision Syria under some kind of transitional pro-Washington government that's going to be based on some ramshackle model that works somehow for Lebanon is basically going to, well, not produce Lebanon, but produce what's happening in Iraq, which means that Syria's minority communities, especially the Alawite, the Druze, and the Christians, will most likely be liquidated by the Islamic State. So Russia stepping in when the United States was unable to has made Russia a major power broker within the Middle East. And on top of that, Russia has solidified its alliance and cooperation with the country that I think is the regional hegemon, and that is Iran. The United States is putting its money in Saudi Arabia. Russia's backing Iran. In the long run, Team Persia has always been there. So in this case, Russia is in a far better international position than it was 20 years ago, but is using its international leverage in the name of international multipolarity. Now, you can argue, however way this is, you can buy it, you cannot buy it, but Russia's foreign policy is the world today is no longer able to be run by any one power. Russia has its role to play in promoting security, stability, and cooperation. So does the United States. So does China. So do other countries. But the United States needs to understand this. Russia's arguing the U.S. needs to understand that there is now a multipolar international alliance in which the United Nations needs to play a more assertive role in also keeping and coordinating peace. So in this sense, Russia has modeled itself not as an aggressor, but more as a counterbalance to U.S. unilateralism. And this, I think, is going to play itself out quite nicely as Biden's administration becomes more and more itching for international intervention, right? Especially in the Middle East, North Korea, maybe even Cuba, right? We don't really know. The thing here is to understand, and this is where I want to end in this discussion, and then we can take this and apply this more so to what's happening in Ukraine, is sovereign democracy is Putin's ideological leadership. Right? It is based on the memories of Russia's chaotic weakness in the 1990s. This cannot be underestimated. So collective memories of economic collapse, fears of political extremism, the shame of the Soviet collapse adds to the understanding that Putin is there to set things right. More to the point is the critical importance of constitutional rule of law. So Putin is going to say, if it's in the Constitution, that's what I'm doing. I'm not ruling unilaterally and arbitrarily. I am defending state institutions. I am upholding legitimate state authority. The biggest fear that Putin has is chaos. The biggest fear that Putin has is internal contagion. So this fear of anti-statism, illegitimate parallel institutions, outside interference with internal affairs are things that he works hard, at least rhetorically speaking, when he's being interviewed, to combat against. So the Maidan revolution in Ukraine was seen as an affront against sovereign legitimate authority. Now you might think to yourself, hey, wait a minute. Didn't Russia just outwardly violate Ukraine's sovereignty by taking Crimea? And Putin's response is the people of Crimea wanted it. Right? The Russian-speaking people wanted it, and I have to abide by their rights of self-determination. So, this constitutional rule of law thing is good when it suits him, but, when it comes to protecting Russians in the near abroad, the laws kind of change here, right? But at the international level, right? Especially when it comes to the UN, right? Sovereign democracy promotes and supports international law, existing UN resolutions, standing international agreements, internationally recognized sovereignty, and if and only if the population wants a new government, then they will go through legitimate electoral procedures. So when Putin is asked, where does your support for Assad end, he will say, when the people of Syria want a new government. And that will be through internationally monitored elections. And it's a nice way of saying that's not going to happen, right? It's a nice way of saying a good number of Syrians aren't necessarily happy with Assad. They know what him and his family have done, but they know that the alternatives are disastrous, right? Absolutely disastrous. Hence, support for Serbia's territorial integrity over Kosovo, as I've already mentioned, the Assad government in Syria, and supporting and fighting for the rights of ethnic Russians outside of Russia, right? And this Putin brand has certainly promoted itself as things that other like-minded leaders around the world want to adopt, right? So for internal consumption, Putin's the guy that cleaned up the town, right? He's the sheriff that came in to get rid of all the bad guys or, force them to work for him. So we're cleaning up the mess from the 90s, economically, militarily, politically, stark improvements. Not only that, but the image of him as this austere, Spartan type of individual, juxtaposed against, inept leaders, corrupt policemen, crazy, silly Boris Yeltsin, certainly plays into that. Go onto YouTube. There are a number of these videos that show, first of all, Putin, when he's engaging the media, is very smart, incredibly intelligent. When it comes to his persona with his own people, he's very charismatic. They love the guy, right? So he's not some buffoon who is just saying this just to get votes, but he has legitimate street credit among many people in Russia. And I know that this might annoy Putin critics, but this is, what we see. Right? This is just how it is. His understanding of global affairs is, micromanagerial precision smarts, right? So he's not just spouting out these empty sound bites that we always hear people in the West talk about, but he knows little details about every single thing. Watch the Charlie Rose interview of Putin. It's about 5-6 years old now, but this is a guy who is not just a president, but he is a career politician, diplomat, and strategist. And this plays rather nicely externally as well, as someone who was the consummate defender of national sovereign interests against encroaching influences from globalization, from neoliberalism, from all sorts of cosmopolitan ideas. And so brand Putin has been kind of redone with Orban, with Vucic. Marine Le Pen certainly finds him to be agreeable. Recep Erdogan, no doubt. Xi Jinping, Silvio Berlusconi, Rodrigo Duterte in the Philippines, Bashar al-Assad in Syria, Gamal al-Sisi in Egypt, even Trump. Everybody's like, Trump is, absolutely in love with Putin. Of course he is. That's the type of person Trump is. Could he replicate that? No, not really. But it's that type of leadership that people who want to assert power at the top either are doing or said that they would do if given the opportunity to come to power, right? Now, obviously, right, he is seen as a heavily, heavily flawed politician within the West. The type of leadership that he has been likened to, a godfather, a thug, a tyrant. When John McCain was alive, he's got all of these, horrible insults and slanders against Putin. He's a threat to liberal democracy. He stamps out any challenges to his rule. There's the poisoning of Alexei Navalny, which is just the one in a line of people that have ended up either exiled, poisoned, dead, a combination of the above here. But this is Russia's current leadership, and it's not going away anytime soon. And this is the type of leadership that exerts itself within the former Soviet Union and increasingly in Eastern Europe and the Balkans, the Middle East, and elsewhere. Okay? So that is a very quick, I'm hoping quick, overview of the current political situation in Russia, the understanding of what sovereign democracy is, and an appreciation, if not at least an understanding of brand Putin, that is the international influencer within this region. So, two things I want to do. One, I want you to look at the interview that I had spliced and diced from 2015. This is Charlie Rose interviewed Vladimir Putin on 60 Minutes. So I've taken the best parts of that and just kind of thrown it together into one video. So it covers Syria, Ukraine, sovereign democracy, relations with the United States, Russia's place in the international arena. And this is from the horse's mouth himself. This is Sovereign Democracy 101. After that, we're going to have a special standalone examination of current conflict resolution in Ukraine, the Donbass crisis, the Orange Revolution, and where we go from there. And then finally, we will finish out this week with our guest speaker, Nikolai Petro, giving more modern, up-to-date information on what's happening in the region. So, a lot of stuff for us to cover once again this week, and it's all really good. It's all pertinent. It's all important. So stick with me here, folks.